Close your eyes and envision the year 1025 AD. You are standing on the sun-drenched shores of the Coromandel coast, where the golden sands of southern India meet the restless turquoise of the Bay of Bengal. For centuries, this horizon represented the limit of the known world, a vast blue expanse that swallowed the sun every evening. But today, the horizon has vanished. It has been replaced by a forest of masts so dense that the ocean itself seems to have been paved with timber. Thousands of flags, deep crimson and emblazoned with the leaping golden tiger of the Chola dynasty, snap fiercely in the monsoon winds. This is not a mere merchant fleet carrying spices and textiles. This is an armada of a scale the medieval world has never witnessed. This is the moment the Indian Ocean ceased to be a neutral waterway and became, for a brief and thunderous window of history, a Chola lake. You are witnessing the birth of the greatest maritime invasion in pre-modern history, an expedition that would travel 1,500 miles across the Black Water to humble an empire that thought itself untouchable. To understand why this fleet is gathered here, we must look back at the man standing on the flagship's deck, Emperor Rajendra Chola I. He was a man born into the shadow of greatness, the son of the legendary Rajaraja the Great. While his father had spent decades consolidating the Chola heartland and building the magnificent Brihadeeswara temple, a mountain of granite that still pierces the sky of Tanjavur today, Rajendra was possessed by a different kind of hunger. He was a conqueror who looked at the map and saw not borders, but possibilities. He had already marched his armies north, reaching the sacred banks of the Ganges River, bringing its holy water back in golden pots to sanctify his new capital. But the land was not enough. To the east, across the churning waters of the Bay of Bengal, lay the keys to the world's wealth, and those keys were held by a rival power that had finally overstepped its bounds. That power was the Srivijaya Empire. If the Cholas were the masters of the land and the near shore, Srivijaya was the phantom of the archipelago. Based primarily on the island of Sumatra and extending its reach across the Malay Peninsula and Java, Srivijaya was a thalassocracy, an empire of the sea. They did not care for vast interior territories or massive land armies. Instead, they sat like a spider at the center of a web, controlling the Straits of Malacca and the Sunda Strait. Every ship traveling from the riches of the Abbasid Caliphate in the west to the splendor of the Song dynasty in the east had to pass through Srivijayan waters. They were the ultimate middlemen, the gatekeepers of the spice trade. For decades, the Cholas and the Srivijayans had maintained a wary, lucrative friendship. They exchanged embassies, ivory, and silken robes. A Srivijayan king had even been allowed to build a Buddhist monastery in the Chola port of Nagapattinam. But beneath the veneer of diplomatic gifts, a tension was simmering, fueled by the most volatile substance in history, profit. The geopolitical landscape of the 11th century was shifting. The Song dynasty in China had developed a voracious appetite for foreign luxuries, frankincense from Arabia, ivory from Africa, and specifically the high-quality cotton and gemstones of southern India. The Chola merchants, organized into powerful, semi-autonomous guilds like the Ayavole 500, were eager to bypass the Srivijayan toll booths. They wanted to sail directly to the ports of Canton and Quanzhou. However, the Srivijayan Maharaja, Sangrama Vijaya Tangavarman, realized that if the Cholas and the Chinese began trading directly, his empire's primary source of income would evaporate. Historical records suggest that Srivijaya began to tighten its grip, perhaps seizing Chola merchant vessels or imposing ruinous duties on Indian goods passing through the straits. In the court of Tanjavur, the reports from the merchant guilds grew increasingly dire. The Chola economy, fueled by the flow of gold from maritime trade, was being strangled. Rajendra Chola I, a king who styled himself as the protector of the world, could not allow a distant maritime power to dictate the terms of Indian prosperity. But launching an invasion across the Bay of Bengal was not a matter of simple bravado. It was a feat of engineering and logistics that defied the limits of the age. The Chola Navy was the pinnacle of medieval maritime technology. Their ships, known as Dharanis and Lulas, were not mere transport vessels. They were sophisticated warships built using the stitched plank technique, where planks of resilient teak were sewn together with coconut fiber and caulked with resins and oils. This made the hulls incredibly flexible, allowing them to withstand the violent battering of the monsoon waves that would shatter the rigid, iron-nailed ships of the west. The Cholas had also mastered the use of the Matsa Yantra, a primitive but effective magnetic compass, and they possessed an intimate knowledge of the stars and the seasonal wind patterns. They knew that to strike Srivijaya, they had to dance with the monsoon. As the fleet prepared to depart from the ports of Nagapattinam and Mahabalipuram, the sheer scale of the operation was staggering. We are talking about hundreds of ships carrying tens of thousands of soldiers. These were not just infantrymen. The Chola Navy transported light cavalry and, most impressively, war elephants. Imagine the engineering required to house a 5-ton elephant on a wooden ship for a 3-week voyage across open water.
These animals were kept in the hull, stabilized by complex harness systems to prevent them from shifting and capsizing the vessel during a storm. Along with the soldiers came the logistics train, ceramic vats of fresh water, tons of dried rice, salted fish, and lentils. The Cholas had turned naval warfare into a science. They utilized vajras, or specialized ramming ships, and smaller, faster scout boats that could dart between the larger galleys to relay signals using smoke by day and lanterns by night. The psychological weight of this journey cannot be overstated. In the religious context of the time, crossing the Kalapani, or Black Water, was often seen as a spiritual risk, a journey that could lead to the loss of caste or divine favor. But Rajendra Chola had cleverly aligned his imperial ambitions with divine sanction. He was the representative of Shiva on earth, and his expansion was framed as the spreading of Dharma. The priests performed elaborate puja ceremonies on the docks, the scent of camphor and sandalwood mingling with the salty tang of the sea. As the emperor boarded his flagship, a vessel adorned with gilded carvings and silken awnings, the drums of the Chola army, the Morisu, began a rhythmic thunder that could be heard miles inland. The strategy was set. This would not be a slow, creeping coastal crawl. Rajendra intended to strike like a thunderbolt. He would utilize the southwest monsoon to propel his fleet straight across the center of the Bay of Bengal, aiming directly for the throat of the Srivijayan Empire. The goal was not just to win a battle, but to dismantle a monopoly. As the anchors were weighed and the massive sails were unfurled, the white canvas catching the wind like the wings of a giant bird, the Chola fleet began to move. The water turned white behind them as thousands of oars dipped in unison. On the shores of India, the crowds watched until the last mast dipped below the horizon, leaving only the empty blue sea. Little did they know that the fleet was sailing toward a confrontation that would reshape the map of Asia and cement the Chola name in the annals of naval legend. The die was cast, the ocean was crossed, and the path to Srivijaya was open.
The salt spray became a constant companion, a fine white crust that coated the bronze skin of the Chola Marines and the dark timber of the ships. To the men aboard those vessels, the world had shrunk to the width of a wooden deck and the infinite stretch of the horizon. This was the Bay of Bengal, known to the Chola as their private lake, but never before had it been challenged in such a singular, concentrated burst of naval power. Rajendra Chola's fleet did not hug the coastline of the Bay of Bengal, creeping along the shores of Kalinga or the Burmese coast. That would have alerted every merchant and spy from the Irrawaddy to the Mekong. Instead, the emperor chose the high road, the deep blue waters of the open ocean. Guided by the ancient science of the Nakudas, his navigators, the fleet utilized the stars of the southern sky and the steady, relentless push of the southwest monsoon. The ships themselves were a marvel of medieval engineering. These were not the flimsy rivercraft of the interior, but Kolandias, massive, multi-masted vessels capable of carrying hundreds of men, war elephants, and months of supplies. Their hulls were stitched together with coconut fiber, a design that allowed the timber to flex against the battering of the monsoon waves rather than snapping under the pressure. Below the decks, the rowers worked in shifts, their rhythmic grunts lost in the roar of the wind. Above them, the Chola Marines, the Velakara, the king's personal guard who had sworn to die for their sovereign, honed their blades. They were a professional army on water, practiced in the art of ship-to-ship boarding and amphibious assault. They knew that the ocean was merely a bridge to a land of unimaginable wealth, a land that had dared to tax the Chola merchants and obstruct the flow of the world's trade. As the fleet carved its way eastward, the isolation of the open sea began to weigh on the men. For days there was nothing but the screaming of gulls and the creak of rigging. Then the first sign of land appeared, the Nicobar Islands, known to the Chola as Manakavaram. This was a critical waypoint. Here the fleet paused briefly, not to conquer, but to take on fresh water and recalibrate their position. The indigenous inhabitants watched from the dense foliage as a forest of masts filled their bays, a sight that must have seemed like a divine visitation. But Rajendra's eyes were fixed further south. He knew that the Srivijayan Empire, a thalassocracy built on the control of the straits, relied on an early warning system of scout ships and coastal outposts. To achieve the shock he desired, he had to strike the northern outposts of Srivijaya before word could reach the capital at Palembang. In the royal court of Palembang, King Sangrama Vijaya Tungavarman sat at the center of a web of gold. The Srivijayan Empire was not a land-based power in the traditional sense. It was a maritime hegemony that controlled the Malacca and Sunda Straits. Every ship passing from the markets of Arabia and India to the ports of China had to pay their dues. This monopoly had made Srivijaya the wealthiest entity in Southeast Asia, a land of gilded stupas and spice-scented air. Sangrama was aware of the Chola's growing power,
but he felt secure behind the vast expanse of the ocean. He believed that no Indian king could project power across such a distance with enough force to do more than a nuisance raid. He had underestimated the logistical genius of Rajendra, who had turned the very monsoon that Srivijayan merchants relied on into a weapon of war. The Chola fleet's first objective was Kadaram, known today as Kedah on the Malay Peninsula. It was the northern gateway to the straits, a vital hub where Indian and Chinese goods were exchanged. As the morning mist lifted over the coast of Kadaram, the Srivijayan defenders were greeted by a nightmare. The horizon was thick with the red and gold banners of the Chola. Rajendra's strategy was one of simultaneous pressure. He did not commit his entire fleet to a single point. Instead, he divided his forces, sending squadrons to strike at the various ports that line the coast, effectively paralyzing the Srivijayan ability to coordinate a counterattack. The assault on Kadaram was a masterclass in amphibious warfare. The Chola ships moved in close to the shore, their high decks serving as floating siege towers. Archers rained fire down upon the wooden palisades of the port, while the massive Tharani ships deployed landing craft. The Chola Marines waded through the surf, shields locked, moving with a discipline that the local levies could not match. The defenders of Kadaram were used to fighting pirates and small-scale raiders. They were not prepared for the organized fury of a professional imperial army. The city fell within hours, its warehouses filled with sandalwood, camphor, and ivory, now under Chola seal. But Rajendra did not linger to enjoy the spoils. He left a garrison and pushed his main force further south, deeper into the throat of the empire. As the fleet moved into the narrow waters of the Malacca Strait, the tension reached a breaking point. This was the heart of Srivijaya's power. The straits were a labyrinth of islands, sandbars, and shifting currents, a treacherous environment for a large fleet. Here, the Srivijaya navy, consisting of fast, maneuverable galleys, attempted to make their stand. They knew these waters. They knew where the hidden reefs lay and where the currents could drag a heavy ship onto the rocks. They utilized fire ships, small vessels filled with pitch and naphtha, sending them drifting toward the Chola line. The sea became a chaotic canvas of fire and blood. Chola sailors used long poles to push the fire ships away, while their own heavy vessels crashed into the Srivijayan galleys, the bronze-tipped rams shattering timber and bone. The naval engagements in the straits were not singular battles, but a series of running skirmishes that lasted for days. Rajendra Chola, overseeing the campaign from his flagship, utilized a sophisticated system of signal flags and drums to coordinate his scattered squadrons. His ability to maintain command and control in the chaotic environment of the straits was perhaps his greatest achievement. The Srivijaya navy, despite their local knowledge, found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the Chola intervention. They were being hunted in their own backyard. One by one, the strategic ports of the Malay Peninsula, Panay, Malayur, and Ilangasaka, fell to the Chola. Each victory tightened the noose around the Srivijayan heartland on the island of Sumatra. News of the northern collapses finally reached King Sangrama and Palembang. The reports were terrifying. The Chola were not just raiding, they were dismantling the empire's infrastructure piece by piece. The king realized that his invincible straits had been breached. He ordered the mobilization of his primary fleet, the elite corps of the Srivijaya navy, to meet the Chola in a final, decisive confrontation. He hoped that by drawing Rajendra into the complex waters near the mouth of the Musi River, he could use the geography to negate the Chola's numerical and structural advantages. As the fleet carved its way eastward, the air grew thick with the humidity of the tropical rainforest. The lush, green coastline seemed peaceful, but the Chola knew that the most difficult part of the campaign lay ahead. They were no longer fighting on the periphery. They were at the gates of the capital itself. The soldiers checked their armor one last time, the metal hot to the touch in the equatorial sun. They had traveled over 1,000 miles across the black water, survived the monsoon, and broken the outer defenses of a great empire. Now, the prize lay before them. The city of Palembang and its golden spires and vast wealth was within reach. But between them and the city lay the remainder of the Srivijaya navy, anchored in a defensive crescent, their oars bristling like the legs of a giant sea creature. The silence between the two armadas was absolute, broken only by the lapping of waves against the hulls. The Chola fleet began to fan out, mimicking the crescent of their enemies, the two great powers of the Indian Ocean finally coming face to face in the shadow of the Sumatran jungle. The stage was set for a clash that would decide the fate of eastern trade for a century. The Chola drums began a low, steady beat, a pulse of war that echoed off the trees. The first Srivijayan war horn answered, a mournful, defiant cry that signaled the beginning of the end.
The sound of the horn hung in the humid air, a long, vibrating note that seemed to physically push against the approaching Chola prows. It was the signal for the Srivijayan vanguard to close the gap. Their ships, known as lenchong, were narrower and faster than the heavy Chola Dharanis, built for the treacherous currents and shifting sandbars of the Musi River. As the two armadas converged, the water between them disappeared, replaced by a churning froth of silt and wake. The Chola commanders, seasoned by decades of conflict in the Palk Strait and the Arabian Sea, did not waver. They understood that this was not merely a battle of wood and iron, but a battle of logistics and spatial control. The Kapal Padai, the Chola Navy, operated on a system of modular command. Each group of 10 ships was led by a Nayak, who in turn answered to a Samantha. This hierarchy allowed the Chola fleet to maintain its crescent formation even as the river narrowed, preventing the Srivijayans from executing their preferred tactic of swarming and isolating individual vessels. The first contact occurred on the Chola left flank. A Srivijayan vessel, its prow carved into the likeness of a snarling Makara, slammed into a Chola transport ship. The impact was a sickening crunch of splintering teak. Almost instantly, grappling hooks, heavy iron claws attached to thick hempen ropes, flew through the air. The Chola Marines, the Maravar warriors, did not wait for the ships to be lashed together. They leaped across the gap, their short curved swords, the vadi, gleaming in the harsh sunlight. These men were professionals, their lives dedicated to the expansion of the Chola Mandala. They wore light breastplates of boiled leather and bronze, designed to offer protection without dragging them to the bottom of the river should they fall overboard. In the cramped confines of the decks, the battle became a rhythmic, bloody affair. The Srivijayans fought with a desperate ferocity, using poisoned blow darts and long spears tipped with jagged stingray barbs, but they lacked the heavy infantry drills that the Cholas had perfected on the plains of South India. In the center of the line, Rajendra Chola I watched the carnage from the bridge of his flagship. He was a man who appreciated the boring details of conquest, the supply lines, the draft of a hull, the exact weight of a grain shipment. He knew that the Srivijayan strength lay in their ability to tax the world's trade, but their weakness lay in their over-reliance on these very waters for protection. He ordered the heavy Dharanis to deploy their secret weapon, large ceramic pots filled with a combustible mixture of resin, sulfur, and oil. These were launched from mechanical catapults mounted on the foredeck. When the pots struck the Srivijayan ships, they shattered, spreading a sticky, unquenchable fire across the wooden decks. The Srivijayan sailors, accustomed to the damp safety of the rainforest, found themselves trapped in an inferno on the water. The smell of burning pitch and salt-saturated wood began to dominate the air, masking the sweet scent of the nearby spice warehouses. As the sun climbed higher, the Srivijayan crescent began to buckle. The sheer mass of the Chola fleet was beginning to tell. It was a slow, grinding process of attrition. For every Srivijayan ship that was boarded and cleared, another was forced back toward the harbor of Palembang. The Musi River became a graveyard of debris. Broken oars, silken banners, and the occasional floating crate of nutmeg drifted downstream toward the sea. The Chola sailors, ever mindful of the profit to be had, were careful not to sink ships laden with valuable cargo if they could help it. They practiced a systematic form of naval warfare, where the goal was capture and subjugation rather than total destruction. This was, after all, a mission of correction, a diplomatic intervention backed by overwhelming force to ensure the smooth flow of maritime commerce. By midday, the outer defenses of Palembang had been breached. The chain boom, a massive iron barrier designed to block the entrance to the inner harbor, was now visible. It was a formidable obstacle, anchored to stone bastions on either side of the river. The Srivijayan king, Sangrama Vijayatungavarman, had retreated behind this line, rallying his remaining elite guards. He believed the chain would hold, forcing the Cholas into a prolonged and costly siege under the blistering sun and the threat of tropical fever. However, Rajendra had anticipated this. He signaled for the Sangadams, the specialized Chola engineering vessels. These were flat-bottomed craft manned by blacksmiths and stonecutters. Under a canopy of shields held by the Maravar, these engineers approached the anchors of the chain. With heavy hammers and chisels and the use of heated vinegar to make the iron brittle, a technique borrowed from ancient texts, they began the laborious task of weakening the moorings. The sound of metal striking metal competed with the cries of the wounded. It was a tedious, exhausting process, the kind of historical detail often overlooked in epic poems, but central to the success of the campaign. For 3 hours, the engineers worked, while Srivijayan archers rained arrows down from the bastions.
The Chola archers responded in kind, their longbows made of laminated bamboo and horn providing a suppressive fire that kept the defenders pinned behind their battlements. Finally, with a sound like a thunderclap, the western anchor gave way. The massive chain recoiled into the water, creating a surge that rocked the nearby ships. The gateway to Palembang was open. The Chola fleet surged forward, no longer in a slow crescent but in a pointed wedge, aiming straight for the heart of the Srivijayan capital. Palembang was a city of water, its houses built on stilts over the river and its temples rising from the solid ground further inland. As the Chola ships entered the inner harbor, the scale of the wealth they were about to seize became apparent. Rows of warehouses, their roofs thatched with palm but their walls built of sturdy brick, lined the quays. These were the storehouses of the world's desires. Sandalwood from Timor, silk from Quanzhou, ivory from Africa, and the ubiquitous black pepper of the Malabar coast. The Srivijayan king's royal barge, a magnificent vessel plated in silver and manned by 100 oarsmen in saffron robes, tried to make a break for the smaller distributaries of the delta. But the Chola Nakas, the swift scouting vessels, were already in position. They cut off the escape route, their prows slicing through the calm water of the inner harbor. The confrontation between Rajendra Chola and Sangrama Vijayatungavarman did not happen on a field of gold, but on the blood-slicked deck of the royal barge. The Srivijayan king, realizing that his maritime empire was collapsing in a single afternoon, stood his ground. He was surrounded by his Bhairavas, warriors who had sworn an oath to die with their lord. The Chola Marines moved in with the efficiency of a harvesting crew. There was no room for grand speeches. The Maravar surged forward, their shields overlapping. The resistance was fierce but brief. One by one the king's guards fell, until only Sangrama remained. He was not killed, he was far too valuable for that. In the Chola philosophy of war, a captured king was the ultimate trophy, a living testament to the Chola emperor's supremacy, and a bargaining chip of unimaginable worth. As the royal barge was secured, the Chola soldiers began the process of boring administration that follows any great victory. They did not simply burn the city, they occupied the key strategic points, the customs houses, the granaries, and the mint. Scribes, who had traveled with the fleet, began to unfurl scrolls of palm leaf. They started the meticulous task of inventorying the Srivijayan treasury. Every bar of gold, every stack of silk, and every bag of aromatics was to be recorded. This was the true end of the battle, the transition from a clash of arms to the cold, hard reality of an accounting ledger. The Srivijayan officials, stripped of their authority, watched in stunned silence as the Cholas systematically took control of the mechanisms of their wealth. The sun began to set over the Sumatran jungle, casting long orange shadows across the Musi River. The smoke from the burning ships still curled into the sky, but the sounds of combat had faded, replaced by the rhythmic shouting of Chola officers organizing the watch and the clink of coins being counted. Rajendra Chola I walked through the halls of the captured palace, his footsteps echoing on the polished stone floors. He was now the master of the Straits of Malacca, the ruler of the waves from the Maldives to the edge of the Pacific. But the occupation was only the beginning. He knew that holding an empire across the black water would require more than just a single victory. It would require the dismantling of an entire way of life and the installation of a new order that favored the tiger over the dragon. The wealth of Srivijaya was now Chola wealth, but the cost of maintaining this hegemony was yet to be calculated. The golden spires of Palembang still caught the last light of day, but they no longer belonged to the house of Sailendra. They were now merely assets in the growing Chola ledger, a boring but vital part of an empire that had redefined the boundaries of the known world.
The ledger was the true weapon of conquest. In the weeks that followed the fall of Palembang, the roar of battle was replaced by the scratching of styluses on palm leaves. Chola administrators, trained in the meticulous revenue systems of the Kaveri Delta, set up tables in the shadow of Srivijayan stupas. They were not interested in the spiritual enlightenment offered by the local Mahayana Buddhism. They were interested in the precise weight of the 72 jewels and the exact volume of the camphor stores in the royal warehouses. This was the boring reality of empire, the transition from violent acquisition to systematic accounting. Rajendra knew that his fleet, as magnificent as it was, could not stay in these waters forever. The monsoon winds that had carried them east would soon shift, demanding their return. The objective, therefore, was not to annex Srivijaya as a province of the Chola heartland, but to transform it into a compliant node in a vast India-centric trade network. The reorganization of the straits was a masterpiece of 11th century logistical engineering. The Chola Navy established a series of small, fortified outposts, not to hold territory, but to serve as victualling stations and repair docks. A ship's hull, after months in the tropical waters of the Malacca Strait, became a miniature ecosystem of barnacles and shipworms. The boring necessity of careening vessels, scratching hulls, and reapplying protective mixtures of lime and vegetable oil was what kept the Chola hegemony afloat. Without these mundane tasks, the most powerful navy in the world would have rotted from beneath before it could ever reach the shores of Nagapattinam. Meanwhile, the political restructuring of Srivijaya was underway. Sangrama Vijaya Tungavarman, the captured king, remained a guest, or perhaps a trophy, of the Chola court. In his place, local elites who were willing to facilitate Chola interests were elevated. The message was clear. The tolls that had once funded the Sailendra dynasty's opulence would now flow toward the Chola treasury, or better yet, be abolished entirely to lower the overhead for the merchant guilds. These guilds, such as the Ayavole and the Manigramam, were the silent victors of the expedition. While Rajendra's soldiers counted their scars, the guild leaders counted their future profits. They were the logistical spine of the Chola world, providing the capital for ship construction and the intelligence for naval maneuvers. In the wake of the conquest, they moved into the markets of Palembang, Kedah, and Jambi with the confidence of state-backed monopolists. They established their own warehouses, or pandikasalas, which were exempt from the heavy taxes previously levied by the Srivijayan crown. For the average merchant from the Song dynasty in the north or the Fatimid Caliphate in the west, the Straits of Malacca were suddenly safer and cheaper to traverse. The Chola peace, as some historians might call it, was less about the absence of war and more about the presence of standardized weights, measures, and predictable customs duties. As the Chola fleet prepared for the journey home, the logistical challenges shifted from occupation to transport. The sheer volume of loot was staggering. Gold statues, silken hangings, ivory tusks, and sacks of aromatic resins had to be balanced carefully in the holds of the vessels. An improperly loaded ship could capsize in the unpredictable swells of the Bay of Bengal, turning a historic victory into a maritime disaster. Rajendra watched as the crates were hoisted, his mind already moving past the riches to the legacy he would build with them. He was not just returning as a king, he was returning as Kadaram Konda, the conqueror of Kadaram. He carried with him the broken pride of a rival empire and the promise of a new era. The return voyage was a slow, triumphal procession across the Chola Lake, a term that was no longer a poetic exaggeration, but a geopolitical reality. Upon his return to South India, Rajendra did not rest on his laurels. He initiated the most ambitious construction project of his reign, the creation of a new capital, Genge Konda Cholapram. It was a city built from the spoils of war and the sweat of thousands of laborers. At its center stood a temple that rivaled his father's great temple at Tanjavur, its walls inscribed with the details of his northern and eastern campaigns. But the most significant part of this new city was not the stone or the gold, it was the water. Rajendra ordered the excavation of the Chola Gandam, a massive artificial lake 16 miles long. This was not merely a decorative feature, it was a sophisticated irrigation reservoir, filled with water brought from the Ganges in the north and the rains of the south. This was the boring history of infrastructure that sustained the empire long after the last soldier had laid down his sword. The lake provided the agricultural surplus necessary to feed the standing army and the naval crews that maintained the empire's reach. The expedition's impact reached far beyond the borders of the Chola Empire. In the courts of the Song dynasty, the news of the Chola victory was received with a mixture of awe and strategic calculation. Chinese records from the era reflect a sudden shift in trade patterns as Chola envoys arrived with more frequent and lavish tribute missions. These tributes were in reality highly organized trade delegations seeking to bypass the intermediaries of Southeast Asia and establish direct lines to the Chinese markets. The Chola naval expedition had effectively removed the Srivijayan middleman, allowing Indian cottons, pearls, and glass to be exchanged for Chinese silk and porcelain with unprecedented efficiency. The boring bureaucracy of the Song customs offices recorded these arrivals with the same meticulous detail as the Chola administrators in Palembang, creating a paper trail of a globalizing world. However, the cost of such hegemony was high. The maintenance of a blue water navy and the garrisoning of distant ports placed a constant strain on the imperial treasury. As the years passed, the administrative friction of managing an empire across the black water began to take its toll. The Srivijayans were down but not out. They gradually adapted to the new order, learning to use the same merchant guilds and diplomatic channels to slowly rebuild their influence. The Chola influence in Southeast Asia didn't end with a single catastrophic defeat, but through a slow, boring process of atmospheric change. Successive Chola kings found it increasingly difficult to justify the expense of massive naval expeditions, when local rebellions and the rise of the Hoysalas and Pandayas demanded their attention at home. The legacy of Rajendra Chola I's naval expedition lives on not in the ruins of Palembang, which have largely been reclaimed by the swamp in the city, but in the cultural DNA of the region. The Sanskrit terms that infiltrated local languages, the architectural motifs that echo Chola styles, and the legal codes that drew inspiration from Dharmashastra were all carried on the decks of those Chola ships. History often remembers the flash of the sword and the sinking of the ship, but the true story of the Chola expedition is found in the ledger, the irrigation canal, and the merchant's contract. It is the story of how a kingdom on the Coromandel coast looked at the vast, terrifying expanse of the ocean and saw not a barrier, but a highway. Rajendra Chola I had proved that the waves could be mastered, the winds could be calculated, and that even the most distant empire could be brought to heel with enough ships, enough gold, and a very long list of assets. As the sun set on his reign, the Chola lake remained calm.
its waters reflecting the glory of a man who understood that history is made by those who pay attention to the boring details of power.